And let's discuss this with Vijay Prashad, Executive Director of the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research and Chief Correspondent for Globetrotter. Welcome to the program, sir. Zelensky's current talks with Trump appear to be much more friendly than their last meeting in the Oval Office, frankly speaking. What might have changed, do you think, besides Zelensky now wearing a suit? Is something big really in the works, do you think?
Well, it's very nice to be with you. Obviously, this is a very interesting day today. And I think what has changed everything was the Alaska summit. It's true that when the meeting between Mr. Putin and Mr. Trump ended, there was no big public breakthrough. They didn't come out there and, shake hands and say we've solved the world's problems. But I think the fact of their meeting in Alaska, Mr. Putin on U.S. soil, despite the fact that there's all kinds of, I would say, threats to him entering U.S. jurisdiction, I think that sent a message to the Europeans. It certainly sent a message to Mr. Zelensky that Mr. Trump is taking Mr. Putin very seriously. And the fact that they said that if Trump had been the president in 2022, it may have been likely that there would have been no war in February of 2022, that the question of the buildup by the Ukrainian forces on the line of control might not have happened and so on. I think this message that Alaska sent to the Europeans was very clear that, they better play the game to come to the table, recognize realities. In a sense, the European leadership was living in a world of unreality. And I think their recognition made Mr. Zelensky change from his military fatigues into a suit, come to the White House, be much more of a supplicant, standing beside Mr. Trump at a map that sends a very clear message that they were discussing the land bridge to Crimea and so on and so forth. I think the atmosphere has decidedly changed. The balance of forces no longer on the side of a kind of maximalist agenda that the Europeans have had, not since February 2022, not even since 2014, but in fact, since the dissolution or the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Since then, the European leadership and large parts of the U.S. Elite have felt that Russia and the former states of the USSR are effectively doormats for their ambition. That sentiment, I think, has now finally been walked back a little bit.
And Trump also mentioned that Zelensky has canceled presidential elections. His presidential term expired last year. This is something that neither Kiev nor its Western allies like to speak a lot about. Do you think Washington might compel Kiev to reverse that decision and actually allow a return to democracy in Ukraine?
Well, if we're going to talk about democracy, we need to talk about a slew of laws that Ukraine has passed in the previous 15 years. There's been a move, again, pushed by the Europeans in a way to egg on Russia, a series of laws that are effectively Ukrainian supremacist. There are a large number of minorities inside Ukraine. By minorities, I mean particularly language minorities, people who speak Bulgarian as their first language or Polish as their first language, also speak Ukrainian, people who speak Russian as their first language. There have been a series of laws that privileged Ukrainians over people who speak other languages, who have other historical, cultural backgrounds and so on. This has not only agitated the Russian-speaking population inside Ukraine, but also agitated Bulgarians, Romanians, Poles, and others. And it's agitated neighboring countries for good reason, because they feel like their fellow countrymen or their language-speaking kin across the border are being discriminated against. So it's not just a question of presidential elections, but I think the ruling elite in Kiev needs to really look in the mirror and ask a question. And so do the European elites. They need to look in the mirror. Do they want to create supremacist states, a sort of Israel inside Europe, Ukraine as the Israel of Europe, where you discriminate against other people by law, not just by prejudice or by practice, but by law? Is this something Germany wants to validate or France wants to validate? I mean, I understand that these countries have their own problem with migration and immigration and so on. But to allow a state which they are backing to the hilt with the war to use a supremacist ideology repeats what's happening with the Israelis and the Palestinians. So it's not just a question of presidential elections, it's a question of the entire direction in which Ukraine had been going for the past 15 years, in a supremacist direction, a kind of Israeli direction. That has to be really considered. And perhaps, if you take my opinion, that should be reversed.
That's an interesting point of view there, especially for those living in Germany, for instance. And Trump also rejected Zelensky's insistence on a ceasefire as a precondition for a permanent peace deal. Thus, Donald Trump appears to be accepting Moscow's stance. Moscow has been saying this for quite some time now. Only a permanent peace should be possible. Could that have been a result of his recent talks with Vladimir Putin in Alaska, do you think?
Well, firstly, it's very difficult to enter the mind of Donald Trump. And I don't want to be one of those that tries to fully interpret what he's saying or exactly what's motivating him. He's pretty mercurial, idiosyncratic character. But I think that here, regardless of what is Moscow's point of view or Ukraine's point of view, it's pretty straightforward that when two countries are in the middle of a conflict, there is a debate often whether a ceasefire should come first or whether the talks should proceed prior to the ceasefire. Because we all know that when a ceasefire is declared, that is sometimes not an advantage to both sides. One side which has had territorial gains may want to have a quick ceasefire, facts on the ground, advantaging them and so on. These are not self-evident issues, whether the ceasefire should come first or whether the talks should proceed before a ceasefire, because both things can happen simultaneously, or you can have a ceasefire first. So it's not self-evident. There's no, better rational position that's above the politics of it. In this case, I think Mr. Trump has accepted what Vladimir Putin has said, in the sense that, look, these two countries are both talking before conflict and ceasefire. They're both talking about security guarantees. In fact, I would say the issue of security guarantees is more important than the guns stopping at the battlefield, because this is an extremely sensitive issue. I would like to say that previous US administrations, whenever they saw a European country or a country within historical Europe attempting to enter the European Union in one way or the other, somehow NATO would show up and say, well, if you're going to enter the European Union, you might as well enter NATO. I looked at the pattern in this, and it's extremely interesting how when countries start making applications to join the EU, very quickly the question of NATO membership comes in. Well, if you ask this question to people who are in and around NATO, it's very clear that the reason this happens is because the United States, until pretty recently, was not keen on allowing an independent Europe. In other words, you didn't want European Union expansion without the United States having an institutional foothold in those countries. The best institutional foothold was through NATO. Now, this is an interesting proposition, because until this second Trump administration, every single US president has been very keen on expanding NATO, using NATO effectively as a Trojan horse for US power in Europe. This Trump administration has sort of withdrawn to a realist foreign policy outlook, saying what's good for the United States should be pursued. And they feel like perhaps NATO as an instrument of US power is too expensive. The Europeans need to take more charge of NATO. I don't think they've necessarily thought through the implication that what this means is that the United States may not have NATO as an instrument for it to extend its control over the European states. I don't think they've thought this through, which is why there's a little bit of incoherence in what Mr. Trump is saying and doing. I wouldn't say necessarily that he's accepted what Mr. Putin or what the Russian view is regarding next steps on the battlefield in Ukraine. I wouldn't necessarily say that. I wouldn't be so sanguine as to say that. On the other hand, I do believe that this sort of incoherence of the Trump foreign policy has aligned him to the view that the Russians have taken all along with the Ukrainians. But again, I would caution that Mr. Trump is known for reversals, because I can't quite put my finger on what his theory is regarding the subordination of Europe. Can't exactly predict what the U-turn might be.
That's absolutely true, and we'll just have to wait and see. Vijay Prashad, Executive Director of the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research and Chief Correspondent for Globetrotter, thank you so much for that thorough analysis.
Thank you so much.